When it comes to Hearthstone, nerfs are a lot more common. Sometimes they do end up buffing a card, and when they do buff that card, it changes the game and how an entire archetype is played, going from a tier 5 deck all the way to a tier 1 deck. So in this video, we're gonna look at the most influential buffs in Hearthstone history. Whoa, when did you get here? Well, while you're here, you might as well subscribe. It's pretty easy, just hit the button down below. Back in the days of Hearthstone Alpha, there was a lot of changes, but two of the changes that they made to Mage definitely changed the way the class was played from there on out. Two of Mage's most popular spells of all time, Fireball and Frostbolt, both got a buff in the mana department, decreasing their total mana cost by 1. Frostbolt went from 3 mana to 2 mana, and Fireball went from 5 mana to 4 mana. This doesn't seem like a huge change, but this definitely set up an ability for Mage to OTK you in one turn after using Alex, giving you enough mana to go Fireball, Fireball, Frostbolt for 15 damage. Also back in Alpha, Mana Worm, which is one of the most popular Mage minions of all time, actually started as a 0/3 rather than a 1/3. After this one change, Mana Worm became a lot better because now when you played it on the board, it wouldn't just get traded in for free, and there was an actual real threat to the card. Mana Worm, after that change, became the premier tempo mage minion that was basically played in every single tempo mage deck from there on out. Those buffs were extremely good to the mage class, but later in Hearthstone we got the biggest buff with Luna's Pocket Galaxy. Luna's Pocket Galaxy went from a 7 mana card to 5 mana, and this basically made the entire meta warp around it. Due to the extremely polarizing effect of Luna's Pocket Galaxy, when you were able to draw it that early in the game and play it for basically no punishment, you were able to just take over the game with insane combos and tempo because all your minions costed 1. You might be asking yourself, Deck of Chaos was recently buffed and it basically does the same thing as Luna's Pocket Galaxy. Why isn't that warping the meta around it? The biggest problem is that Warlock doesn't really have burn from hand at the moment, where Mage did, so you could play Alex into a bunch of burn or just a ridiculous Antonidas combo, where Warlock's a lot more board based, so it doesn't feel as punishing. Also, the metagame right now is a lot more aggressive, and the ability to push damage is a lot more threatening in today's current Hearthstone metagame. In Forge of the Barrens, we were introduced to Hero Power Mage with Wildfire and Mordrush Fire Eye, which were both really interesting cards, but did not really work out because Wildfire was at 2 mana, which means you'd have to play it for 2 mana and then Hero Power after, which felt horrible, and Mordrush was 10 mana, which felt a little bit slow for the effect. So they did end up buffing Wildfire from 2 mana to 1 and Mordrush from 10 mana to 8 mana. These two buffs basically brought Hero Mage back from the dead and enabled a class archetype that we have not really seen in a while with Hero Power Mage. On to Paladin with one of the best changes the class has ever seen, to Elder Attendant. This card used to be a 2 mana 2/3 with the same effect, but then it was buffed to a 1 mana 1/3. This change basically brought Paladin to a tier 1 deck because it was able to actually be proactive on turn 1 rather than just doing absolutely nothing. The benefit of this is that Libram Paladin was able to play a minion on turn 1 and gain the ability to actually get some tempo so they can finally get to their late game finishers with Libram of Hope and Lady Liadrin. Now obviously with more cards being added that help the archetype, Libram Paladin got a lot better, but this fundamental change to Elder Attendant basically propelled the class into what it was today. An arguably bigger change to Paladin was with Crystology, which used to be 2 mana until they buffed it to 1 mana. This change allowed Paladin to have actual card draw at a time where Paladin virtually had 0. The buff to Crystology was ginormous for OTK Shirvallah Paladin, where it was able to cycle through its deck faster and find its actual game-winning finisher. But this card cannot be understated in multiple other Paladin decks because it was able to be played in Mac Paladin and so many other decks because it turned out drawing 2 cards for 1 mana is pretty freaking good. Moving on to everybody's favorite class, Priest. Priest had a lot of fundamental changes to the class over the years, but there are some cards that I need to mention in this video because they got a lot of great buffs. Starting off in Hearthstone Alpha, we saw a huge buff to Northshire Cleric that went from 2 mana down to 1 mana. Kind of like the Elder Attendant buff as well, this enabled Priest to have a really good 1-drop, but on top of this, due to Northshire Cleric's effect, have the ability to Hero Power on turn 2 for an extra card draw that Priest desperately needed back in Classic. This change also enabled probably the most archetypes out of any other card in a singular class because Northshire Cleric was basically used in every single Priest deck until, well, you know, it finally got Hall of Famed. That 1 mana change was fundamental to Priest's entire archetype, and it's kind of sad that we don't see Northshire Cleric anymore because it was a pretty fun card to use. We also saw one of the best buffs in the game with Extra Arms and Savers of Uldum, where it was going from 3 mana for both the spell and the extra copy you got in hand to 2 mana. Now, this change may not seem super impactful, but there was a deck called Combo Priest which played for tempo, which Priest doesn't normally do, and it was, well, really freaking strong because the snowballing potential of this card on potentially a Northshire Cleric or any of the early game minions you would play could just completely win a game on its own, and they ended up nerfing it back to 3 mana because how strong it felt. Now, all of these buffs are insanely powerful and they definitely changed the game for the better, but some of the buffs that I have not mentioned yet are probably the strongest that we'll see in Hearthstone. Starting off with Starving Buzzard, which was a 2 mana 2/2 with the wording whenever you play a beast, draw a card. Now, this card obviously was not super good because not only did you have to play Starving Buzzard, but you have to have beast in your hand in order for you to actually start drawing and cycling cards. Blizzard decided to change this card from when you play a beast to when you summon a beast, which fundamentally changed how Hunter was playing the game because they finally had a very powerful draw engine in their classic set. One of the strongest draw engines we've ever seen is Starving Buzzard into Unleash the Hounds, because not only do you get an insane amount of tempo, but you can also use the hounds to trade into other minions in order for you to get the board back while gaining a lot of resources. This combination made Hunter one of the best classes for an extremely long period of time until they finally nerfed Starving Buzzard to 5 mana for some reason. Knife Juggler also went through the same kind of a change, with rather than being when you play a minion to deal 1 random damage, it went to when you summon a minion. Because Knife Juggler was a neutral card, there was a lot more ways to abuse this effect, and with more cards being released in later expansions, we got to see this with cards like Implosion, Muster for Battle, and so much more. If you remember playing against Knife Juggler, you could probably remember that this card could decide the outcome of a game in the early turns just by clearing an extra minion, and this change definitely made that happen. Now, the biggest buff in history has to go to Unleash the Hounds. In Alpha, the card said give your beast +1/+1 in charge, which obviously was a super powerful effect. So they decided to rework it entirely to read, for each enemy minion, summon a 1/1 hound with charge. This is the effect that we currently see in Hearthstone, but when it was first reworked, it was at 4 mana, which obviously was a very slow card. And the first buff they gave it was to make it cost 2 mana. Now picture this with Starving Buzzard. This effect was absolutely bonkers and basically terrorized the metagame when this was at 2 mana. Blizzard then decided to nerf it to 3 mana, which seemed like the sweet spot for the card Unleash the Hounds. Now, you might be asking yourself, Rarran, why don't they do buffs more often? It turns out when you have a very powerful effect and you buff a card, that powerful effect is still there, so they have to do more nerfs more often than buffs. That's the end of this video. I hope you ended up enjoying it, and if you did, I'd appreciate a subscription. You look fantastic.